Welcome to the first episode of the Theology Monke podcast. I am your host, Bobby Fellingham, filling in for John Johnson, who is in Jerusalem filling in for Tom Eggerstein, who was supposed to perform as Philip in a reenactment of the Pentecost. Sadly, this episode will also be our last, because John Oliver didn't sponsor us. Today we will be discussing The Mission, a movie that I personally loved. Joining me to discuss this movie is our resident AI, Carl Furtado, and our in-house chess grandmaster, Christian Sanders. Hello, gentlemen.
Hello, Bobby. It's a pleasure to meet you, and I'm very excited to be on the first episode of the Theology Monke.
Hello, Mr. Fellingham. I'm excited to be here today. I had to take a break from my studies to arrive on this podcast. Flew into the set early, and I'm excited for our conversations today.
Okay, so we're gonna begin with a simple question. What did you think of the movie? We'll start with you, Carl.
So I thought the movie was amazing, and it depicted a lot of theological themes, which we'll be talking about in this episode. And one of the ones that really stood out to me was peace and violence, and I saw that same theme in Romero, which we had watched earlier.
Christian?
Yeah, I enjoyed the movie, and I especially liked the aspects that were displayed of essentially why Portuguese and Spanish colonization was important in the Americas, and I thought it was quite interesting to watch, and I thought it gave me better cognitive development of theology and the spreading of Christianity.
I personally thought it was a great movie, as I said before. What really stood out to me the most was the aspects of just war in this movie, and the different paths that Father Mendoza and Father Gabriel end up taking, as well as all the other Jesuits. And so that's what we're going to be talking about first. So Carl, I'll start with you. Who do you think was right? Do you think it was Father Mendoza was right for staying and fighting with the Guarani, or do you think Father Gabriel was right for just peacefully continuing to serve the Guarani, or the other Jesuits who went home as they were commanded?
So that's actually a very interesting question. And in this instance, I will not side with any of the Jesuits who followed the command. And although that's one of the vows that they take, to follow their superiors, in this instance, Father Mendoza and Gabriel are trying to protect the Guarani, and in that spirit, they should have fought for the rights of the Guarani and not followed their orders. And between Father Mendoza and Gabriel, I can't exactly say, because some could argue that Mendoza's fight was a just reward. Technically, it was the last resort, because they had failed in diplomacy with the Cardinal and with the Spanish, and it was technically legitimate authority. It was the Jesuits and the Mission of San Carlos, which could be argued against, but I would see that as a legitimate authority. And also, he was motivated by justice. He wasn't trying to get vengeance on anyone. He was trying to protect the people, so that was motivated by justice, and he was trying to not have their home be unfairly destroyed. And then he was also conducting the war justly. I don't think he was, committing any horrific acts while he was fighting. He was only doing what he needed in order to keep the people safe. And also that the war his fight would have brought a more just and peaceful end, because the Guarani would have been saved. Now, the only thing that I would see wrong with Mendoza's fight is that in one part of the movie, you can see he slits the throat, or I believe, of a Spanish soldier, or Portuguese soldier, and this, you can see how he renounces his vows of peace. And as a member of the Jesuit order, even if the points of his fight were just, I don't know if it's justified for him to renounce his vows of peace and commit violence as a Jesuit.
Yeah, I agree with pretty much everything you said there. But the one thing that I would disagree on was that you said that the war that the battle Rodrigo fought against the Portuguese. You said it was waged by a legitimate authority. I can't say I agree with that because I don't think that Rodrigo himself is a legitimate authority. I feel like it was kind of just his idea, and he just like rallied the people behind him. So that's not a legitimate authority. But I feel like everything else that you said I do agree with. Christian, we'll go to you. What did you think about Father Mendoza, Gabriel, the other Jesuits, just war?
Yeah. So I'll add on to a little bit of what Mr. Furtado said. I think that the art of violence isn't really exactly the greatest solution to the problem because whether it be just or the reasoning or logic behind it, violence leads to bloodshed, and bloodshed leads to casualties. And in the spirit of pacifism and the spirit of Christianity, I don't think that the war was essentially like necessary. I think that the reasoning was necessary because the Guarani needed a place to live and they needed to be saved. But I don't think that a violent conflict is the correct solution, although it's tricky because I don't think the Portuguese would choose any other route. I think they would go straight to violence. But yes, I think that I don't think that the violent solution is ideal, or necessary, but I think it might just be what comes to be because of the circumstances.
I wanted to ask you about something you said. You said violence is not the answer. So I wanted to ask, what do you think would be the correct answer in that scenario?
Yeah, well, I think that considering that at this point in time, Portugal and Spain were essentially the two major Christian conquerors of South America, and the crucial point that's being argued upon is the enslavement of the Guarani. I think that there should be some sort of political or some sort of like diplomatic agreement made between the two countries that essentially allow the mission to thrive and continue on, as opposed to being, and I quote, uncivilized like species, I guess, which is what the movie said, because essentially they weren't really recognized as like equal to the Christians, even though they were becoming Christian. So I kind of feel that violence, although it's not the answer, I think that it's just what it came to be because there wasn't really a way that the Portuguese were going to fall back on what they wanted.
So since the church, the Portuguese and the Spaniards have already made their decisions in terms of keeping the mission or destroying it, are you saying that violence is not the answer, but Mendoza had no choice?
Yeah, essentially, Mendoza especially is in a tricky situation because he's recently resorted to violence to kill his brother, and he's very familiar with it. And previous to being a Jesuit, he was essentially a prisoner and, a lost man, lost in his mentality. And I think that once he reaches this situation, the only solution he knows is violence. But I think since like all diplomatic options have kind of been eliminated essentially, I think that it's quite like implied that even before the like violence occurs at the end of the movie, I think it's implied that it will be the way that it ends, considering that neither the mission nor the Portuguese people are willing to kind of surrender on this point or make a compromise. So although I don't think it's the best solution for the good of the church, I think that it is the solution that arose because all other options were not viable.
Yeah, and the one thing I want to add here is that Rodrigo he took a vow to listen to Father Mendoza's authority and take all of his commands without a second thought, and he did go back on that vow at the end of this movie, right? Father Gabriel said, "Don't fight in this war. We have to be peaceful. We have to be the forces of good, Christianity." And Father Mendoza did not do as he said. So I can't. I don't know if I can say that his fight against the Portuguese was just because, as I said before, it was not waged by a legitimate authority. He just did it himself, and he actually went against what the proper authority said. Um, so I can't say that that was a just war. I can't say that that's what Father Mendoza should have done in this scenario, because I think, in my opinion, it just led to unnecessary carnage and unnecessary death, because the majority of the population was murdered by the Portuguese anyway. So I don't think Father Mendoza did the right thing by starting a war by himself against the Portuguese.
I agree with the fact that, yes, he's not that much of a legitimate authority himself. Even as the Jesuits as a whole, they're not a legitimate political authority. But I do want to ask, do you think that it's like if one vows to obey leadership, should they, religious or not, should they always keep that? Should Father Mendoza's actions be invalidated or unjustified because just for the sole fact that he didn't listen to Father Gabriel?
I think that if you take a vow, you need to keep that vow. Like, if you're taking a vow to submit to authority, you have to keep that vow unless the authority does something absolutely like egregious. And in my opinion, Father Gabriel did not do anything egregious by saying, we want to be peaceful, we don't want to fight, this is not our fight. So I think there are definitely scenarios where you shouldn't listen to authority. Like, I don't know. Yeah, like there's definitely scenarios.
Nazis.
Yeah, exactly, right? If you took a vow to the Nazis and then you see what they're doing, you shouldn't keep that vow anymore. But in this scenario, there wasn't anything egregious going on, so I think Father Gabriel should have kept his vow to Father Mendoza. So that was actually a pretty nice segue. So the next question I'm going to pose to you is going to also be about Rodrigo. It's going to be about the scene where Rodrigo does his penance by carrying that giant bag of armor up the mountain. And so what I want to ask you is, do you think Rodrigo adequately atoned for his sins? His sins being he was a slave trader. He killed his brother. So do you think he atoned for his sins by carrying the bag of armor up the mountain? I'll start with you, Carl.
Yeah, so I don't, I guess him carrying up the bag of armor up the mountain was just a point of reflection for him. I think the real atonement that he had for his sins was like him breaking, like after he killed his brother, obviously he went into a complete shell and he like closed everything out, like off to everyone else. I think his real penance for his sins was him coming out and then helping the Guarani, which he once hunted. So I think that was his real atonement for his sins.
Yeah, so I think in a way it was kind of a figurative display of what his penance was going to represent, because I think if you take it at face value, that's not really a fair penance or enough to make up for the amount of wrongs that he's put into the world. But I think it's more of a figurative statement for that he had to carry not only a burden of dealing with his previous sins, but additionally dealing with the quote-unquote burden of like being devout to not just the Jesuit order, but also being devout to like fighting against his previous cause, which is slave trading, because he went from the slave trader at the very start of the movie to essentially a warrior against that. So I kind of feel like just lifting the bag of armor up the mountain isn't really the penance, so to speak. I think that's just a representation. But yes, I think that overall, I think over the course of the movie, I think his penance, I think he served it. But I don't think that the lifting of the armor was the only penance that he served.
Yeah, so I like what you guys said about how lifting the armor wasn't actually the full penance. The penance he really served was serving the Gorani, and helping them find God. But the other thing I do want to ask you about Rodrigo is, or about his penance. What do you think that bag of armor represented in terms of sacraments and symbols? What do you think that bag of armor represented in the sacrament of reconciliation? And what do you think What do you think him carrying the bag of armor up to the top of that mountain? What do you think that represented?
Yeah, I think that it's actually quite important that it was a bag of armor and not a bag of swords or a bag of sticks. Because the reason why it's armor specifically is because I think it resembles that. This might be a little bit too metaphorical, but that God is essentially taking upon like the duty to protect all of his followers, despite the ones that have essentially turned away and committed murder and committed essentially on like mass torture of a lot of people by slave trading. I think that it kind of represents God's protective nature of bringing him back to see the light, and I also think that just the fact that even if it's not armor, the fact that he's lifting an object up a hill is kind of like his journey back up the mountain to be in the like forefront and the faith of God.
Yeah, I like what you said there. Yeah, Carl.
I really like what Christian said about the armor and how it shows that God is not disposed to violence; he's predisposed to peace, and also how like he's bringing up his burden. He's taking his burden up through the mountain to be in the presence of God.
Yeah, I agree with what both of you said. I especially like what Christian said about showing the protective nature of God, and I also think it just I feel like that bag of armor also just represented like the burden of his sins, really. And so when he made it to the top of that mountain, and then they like chucked it off the mountain, I feel like that kind of represented just the burden of his sins kind of being released. And well, I don't think he didn't fully atone for them at that point. I feel like the burden that he felt was gone when they tossed the bag over the cliff. And so, my next question to you guys is going to be, do you think that the Jesuits were right in civilizing the Guarani culture, especially considering the fact that they would have been sold into slavery immediately had they not set up a mission there? Do you think that justifies the fact that the Jesuits just came into a random tribe and tried to civilize them by teaching them Christianity? Do you think it's justified?
Yeah. So I don't really like the word civilizing because like if you see in the movie in the mission at the mission they're still wearing their same clothes that they used to wear. They're speaking the same language. I don't think the Jesuits tried to civilize their culture. They just tried to present God to them, and if they accepted God, then that's great. Then I feel like they weren't forcing anything upon the Guarani, and I do think that they were justified because in their eyes, they were just trying to help the people by spreading the word of God to them, and they didn't force it upon them with violence or anything. They simply offered their religion to them and let them accept it. So I think the Jesuits were justified in doing what they're doing.
Yeah, I agree with what Carl said. I don't think that civilized is the correct way to describe it. Also, I think that while it was not a forced conversion, because you can tell by the dialogue how it was more of a hope that they would convert rather than like enforced. So not only do I think it's like not really civilizing, more just like attempting to convert, I also think it's very beneficial to the Guarani because first and foremost, they're in the light of the church and they're able to like be even if they don't agree with the religion, they'll be in the safety of the church. And they'll essentially be able to use that to essentially try and have an argument against being enslaved. And additionally, I think that it was still righteous because even though you can say, well, they came in and, quote unquote, invaded their land, I think that it was more of like a helpful mission than it was a hurtful one, because if you consider how, first of all, just how much more like how much more infrastructure was developed, like all of the houses and all of the different machinery that was essentially used in the movie. I think that it was definitely beneficial, and it was definitely a new era for the people, even if it was only for a short time before violence broke out. But yeah, I think that it's not really civilized, but I do also think it's righteous.
Well,
yeah.
I don't. Sorry, can I?
No, you can go. You can go.
So I don't really know how you can say that they weren't civilizing their culture, because I feel like that's exactly what they were doing. I mean, sure, you can say they were preaching the gospel, they were teaching them about Christianity, but they came in. That civilizing is still exactly what they were doing. They were pushing them towards what they believed was a civilized culture, and that being European culture and Western culture. They at the beginning of the movie when we first meet them, a lot of them aren't fully clothed, but by the end of the movie, the majority of them are covered, and they're clothed, and so I feel like that is a perfect representation of the Jesuits civilizing their culture. I mean, sure, you can debate the merits of that word, but I still feel like that's exactly what they're doing. And given the fact that at that time they didn't even know that those people would be sold into slavery if they didn't set up the mission, that's the thing that they figured out later in the movie. I don't think that they are justified. I don't think that any of that colonization is justified, because what you're doing is just you're taking this group of people who's happy living the way that they're living, and then you're just making them into the culture that you want them to be and making them live the way you want them to live. Also a lot of times just killing them by disease. I mean, they didn't know that at the time, but the majority of the people would have died by some sort of epidemic anyway. So I don't think that anyone is justified in civilizing a culture, regardless of whether you're setting up a mission or not. I still don't think you're justified.
Yeah, well, I mean, I feel like the Guarani accepted the religion. I mean, as you see at the end, after Father Gabriel was shot and falls, one of the Guarani boys picks up the cross and continues marching forwards with it. But I also like the interesting question that you brought up, as the cardinal says at one point in the movie, he wondered that if the Guarani preferred that the Jesuits had never came. So I do like the question that you brought up there.
So yeah, essentially, I think that if you talk about how if it was kind of justified, or if it was the right thing to do with essentially a foreign religion, foreign people from a different country and who worship a different deity, or if any deity, I feel like if you look at that and say, how can that be righteous? Because it's kind of this foreign occupation. I think that still, if you look at the overall, and we'll use the word civilized, I already explained why I don't think that that's the correct word, but just for lack of a better explanation, I think that it was most certainly beneficial because, as you said, their culture evolved, their infrastructure evolved, and they essentially they underwent kind of an enlightenment of their own, kind of in an area in the West which has been secluded from Europe and a lot of the other world for a very long time in history. So I think that I would say that even if it's maybe not to our moral standards in present day, I think that at the time, since it, one, wasn't harmful, and two, was not imposing a religion upon them, rather just suggesting it, I think that, yeah, it was definitely righteous movement, especially because the way that the Jesuits operate, it's usually a very peaceful movement. And yeah, I think that it was most certainly a justified movement, and I actually think that it was probably definitely good for the not just the people, but also for the advancement.
Yeah. Okay, so we're almost out of time, but I do want to ask really quickly how you guys saw the relationship between church and state play out in this movie, and especially towards the end of the movie. So we can start with you, Carl.
Yeah, so you can see that the relations are definitely tense, and I feel like it was almost it was very complex because it was like church versus state, but also internally church versus church, because on one hand it was the church and the Portuguese trying to figure out, all right, what do we do with the mission, and then on the other hand it was the mission trying to fight both the church and the Portuguese, because both their decisions led to the mission being destroyed. And so I feel like in this scenario, since the church does have a mission there, I think that it is under the church's jurisdiction, regardless of who owns the land politically. The church should have a say, and also the Jesuits at the mission should have a say in the church's decision also.
Yeah, so what I'll say is that the church and the state, although they're often compared to be the same thing, I feel like there's many states and many different countries are part of the church, but the church isn't exactly the identifying body of the state. I feel like it's more the government political structure versus the religious structure. And yeah, I don't think that they're the exact same or that they completely compare, but I think that the church tries to take that identity and represent the states.
So I like what all of you said, and thank you for joining me on this podcast. No thank you to John Oliver, because he did not sponsor this podcast, and now we're not going to be able to have another episode. So I hope you're happy, John.
If you can donate, please donate.
If you can donate.
Yeah, it would help us a lot.
Once again, thank you guys for joining me, and thank you, dear listener, for tuning in to this episode and the last episode of the Theology Monke podcast. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.